Welcome to Advice for Grad Students. I'm your host, Phil Haun, and I am joined today with Josh Shifrinson, who's an associate professor at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. But most importantly, he's an alum of the MIT SSP program. Josh, welcome to Advice for Grad Students.
Hey, Phil, happy to be back.
All right, glad to have you here. I want to throw out a disclaimer that the thoughts revealed here today are our own and not necessarily those of any institution. Josh has agreed to talk about archival research, and I want to ask the question, why did you pick archival research?
I picked archival research because it is a topic that has been central to my own research agenda. It's central to many others' research agendas, and it's something that is not taught in any graduate program that I can identify. Graduate IR program that I identify.
All right. Well, we got 9 minutes left, so let's learn about archival research from one of the experts.
Well, let's start with what an archive is, right? An archive is just a depository of material from some actor of interest. You know, it might have this mythological characteristic. You know, it's an archive. It's dusty. It's scary. You know, Indiana Jones stuff with boulders. But it's just a depository of documents. Now, when I say that, there are tons of different archives out there. There are personal archives, there are federal or national level archives, there are local government archives, and archives can vary in a number of dimensions. Their scope, as you just figured out, their organization scheme, how well structured they are internally, the period and actors which they cover, and perhaps most importantly, their accessibility to researchers, how easy it is for researchers to get in there, and how records are retained. You know, we're right now in the news, we have questions over whether the National Archives have all the documents from the Donald Trump presidency. A question over whether policymakers selectively remove documents always comes up when we start talking about what archives are. But let's say we've identified an archive that is, you know, relevant for our research, has the actors we care about, covers the time frame we're interested in, is reasonably open for archival research. Well, once we start thinking about what we're going to use archival evidence for, how should we think about it? Well, I think archival research can perform 4 functions for researchers. First, you can use archive to compile a data set or a universe of cases. This is what actually allows you to do quantitative analysis. For those interested in the topic, go check out Lindsay O'Rourke's book on covert action. She uses archives to compile a data set of covert action cases. Second, you can use archives to measure variables that are often hard to measure. Elizabeth Saunders' work on presidential interventions actually uses archives very creatively to code presidents' attitudes towards the sources of international problems. Third, perhaps the most common, you can use archival research to test causal mechanisms, see if variable A leads to variable B through the pathways that you identify by looking at how policies are made, actors react to events and beyond. And then finally, something that I don't think we appreciate very often, looking at archives can reveal an incredible amount of unexpected or unexplained variation in the empirical record, which can actually open up the door for new avenues of research. You know, when I was doing my book, I was in the archives reading about all these American efforts to really kick the snot out of the Soviet Union as the Soviet Union was declining. And this was very surprising because the conventional narrative at the time, the historiography, was emphasizing how cooperative the United States was as the Cold War ended. So here immediately I had some unexplained variation to try to get into. So archives can perform a series of functions. But what are you going to do with that archival evidence? In other words, how are you going to access it? How should we think about integrating it into a research project? It may be surprising, but archives are incredibly easy to get to. You know, once you paid for the flight to travel to some foreign place and perhaps found a place to stay, most archives are fairly welcoming to researchers. This is not, well, when I say archives are welcoming to researchers, you might need a letter of introduction from your home institution. You might need some trinkets to bribe archivists. This is not a joke. In some countries, archivists actually like it when you bring trinkets to bribe them. But let's say you're going to the US National Archives, Presidential Archives, the British Archives in Kew, the French National Archives, you know, state archives. They're fairly easy to get to once you read the rules, and often the rules are available online. And what's going to happen is you'll walk in, you'll be taken through some kind of background briefing to be told, don't steal archival documents. You will nod sagaciously when they tell you not to steal archival documents. Do not steal archival documents. You read up about Sandy Berger if you have questions about this. And once you're in the archive, some of them allow you to take pictures of the archival documents. So you can just go through folders and rapidly take pictures. Some of them require you to type up notes only, so you take notes in the different archival documents. Some of them require you to take notes on it with paper and pencil, so you take notes with paper and pencil. But the bottom line is, once you are in an archive, you simply go to an archivist, you ask them, hey, I'd like to request such and such files or files on such and such a topic. They will often harangue you or dialogue with you, as the case might be. You'll get the documents, and then using whatever specifications they have, take pictures, take notes on the materials, and really do not steal the documents. Now, once you've acquired, sorry, Phil, go ahead.
No, keep going.
Oh yeah, and so once you've acquired this evidence, either by pictures or taking notes, you have to start integrating into your research. And the question is immediately going to pop up, well, how do I do this? Well, there are, I think, two things to keep in mind. One is that you can't let the archive speak for themselves, right? Evidence doesn't speak for itself. Before you have even gone into an archive, in fact, you should have developed an argument, developed hypotheses, and developed indicators that you will use to code variables or measure processes. And so your job when using the archival evidence is to make sense of whether the evidence accords with your predictions or the predictions for some alternative theories and beyond. So you're not actually doing induction here. You're using the archival evidence to speak to social science concepts. And in doing so, you will also need to consume ahead of time the secondary literature, another historian, work by historians to see if other research is out there and perhaps what files might be relevant. So you can kind of talk about the relevance of the data to your topic and how the archives compare and comport and compare with other potential sources of evidence. Now that's the first task. The second task, though, is to justify the archival evidence, because archives are subject to some pathologies. Not all archives are complete. Policymakers often throw out documents or don't record everything. There's never a possibility of a researcher reading everything that's in an archive. They're voluminous. You know, the National Archives contain quite literally billions of cubic feet of archival evidence. You can't read that even in a lifetime. And finally, because you are looking for indicators or trying to check archival evidence against indicators that you've developed or social science concepts that you've been grounded in, you're at risk of confirmation bias. That, in other words, just seeing the evidence that you want to see in the material. And so your job is to establish rules for yourself and explain to readers why the evidence you've acquired is representative. This can be done with the logic of sampling. It can be done using the logic of just reading a complete set and reporting on the most common arguments or ideas or indicators found in that set, or the approach that I think is most accurate, knowing the arguments that policymakers are using and developing a honed sense of importance based on the archives themselves to explain what looks to be going on, and then justifying why that particular piece or pieces of evidence are especially salient for your research project and defending that. And of course, that's, I simply said that's a confirmation bias issue. Well, to some degree, that's true. But at the same time, if you then go ahead and embrace the norm of transparency, sharing your documents with others after your work has come out, and encouraging replication, encouraging examination of other cases, you mitigate the risk of confirmation bias because you're expanding the data set, expanding the universe of cases, and offering a version of intercoder reliability. So I think those who are interested in archival research really have a huge resource in front of them. We often think of archival evidence as entirely qualitative in nature. I don't think that's accurate. As I mentioned, you can use archives to develop data sets and test different parts of an argument. But regardless, archives are one of the most underutilized and important tools in a researcher's disposal, and especially for those contemplating careers in political science or their own dissertations. Get started, go early. Archival research is hard, it's difficult, it's time consuming, but it can be incredibly rewarding.
I tell you what, I think I just heard a theory of archival research. There needs to be a book that comes out of that. You covered every question I wrote down here, you covered, but I had one, which is most common mistakes first go into an archive. For someone who's going to the archive for the first time, what are the most common mistakes and how to avoid it? Within a minute. Focusing on the senior policymakers. It is amazing that one of the most common mistakes people make is to look at the senior officials, whatever level you're talking about, to think that they're going to have the relevant evidence. It is amazing how little policymakers or senior leaders want to hold on to evidence. They push it down to their underlings. Look a level or two below where you think you're going to be looking. The second mistake people make is to simply expect the archives to speak for themselves. You're entering a domain where people are engaged in day-to-day drudgery on top of big decisions that you're interested in.
And so you have to wade through a morass in order to find the relevant evidence. And that's one of the reasons why, to go to a point I mentioned a few minutes ago, simply reporting on what's most common in an archive is not a solution. You need to hone a sense for what's important based on what looks to be mattering to the people day in, day out. And it is an incredibly frustrating process to get nothing but bureaucratic slips over and over. But when you find a nugget of gold, it is incredibly thrilling.
Yeah. Okay. I completely agree with you. I really like the part about prepping for the trips because you can waste an entire research trip by not being ready for it. So
yeah. Read ahead of time. Seriously, read ahead of time.
Exactly. You got to be prepped for it. Okay. Well, thanks, Josh. Incredibly useful. Thanks for joining us today for Advice for Grad Students.
Oh, thank you. Awesome.